Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much, Eric, for inviting me to talk today. Yeah, I'm honoured to be asked, and I enjoy talking about this subject. So I've been looking forward to this. Also, we just want to thank the students that have come this morning at 8 o'clock in Kansas, 8 o'clock in the morning. I know when I was a first-year student, I don't think I ever got up before 10 o'clock in the morning. So I'm pretty impressed by your dedication towards this subject. So thanks very much for coming. It's about 7 o'clock in the evening in Nepal at the moment. Just to warn you, we may be disturbed by barking dogs or internet problems or power cuts, which is all part of the Nepal experience. So I just want to prepare you for that in advance. And if they don't happen, then we can count ourselves lucky. So in terms of the presentation I'm going to do today, I've got a series of slides which I'll talk to. By all means, butt in and ask a question if there's something that's not clear or you want to know some more information about something. I don't want it to be too formal. You're welcome to ask questions through the presentation. If you've got a broader question, I might say, let's keep that till the end, and then we'll try and have a bigger discussion at the end about some of these issues. But by all means, do ask questions throughout the presentation if you want to, or save them to the end. It's up to you. So yeah, my name is Martin Punaks. I'm the country director for Next Generation Nepal. We're a United States international NGO based in Oregon and Kathmandu in Nepal. I'm going to be talking today about Nepal orphanage voluntourism, as Eric explained. So in essence, what this presentation is about how volunteers come to Nepal. They volunteer in orphanages thinking they're helping children, but they are unwittingly actually contributing to the process of child trafficking and the unnecessary displacement of children from their families, so that they're put into profit-making orphanages. Has the next slide come up? Just checking.
Yes.
That's good. Okay, so I'll just start off by saying a little bit about Next Generation Nepal to put our work in context. So Next Generation Nepal, or NGN, as it's called, was founded by Connor Grennan, an American citizen who came to Nepal in 2006 and volunteered in an orphanage in Kathmandu alongside a friend from France called Farid Mansour. They had no skills in working with children particularly, or Farid had some, but certainly not Connor. And they were having a wonderful time supporting these orphans in this orphanage, until one day, almost by accident, they discovered that these children were not in fact orphans. They all had living parents, or most of them had living parents, and they'd all been trafficked, and they'd been threatened and told, you can't say that you're not orphans, otherwise you'll be harmed, your families will be harmed. So Connor and Farid set about trying to find these children's families. They were successful in that. They were able to reconnect the children with the families and ultimately reunify them. And thus NGN was born as an NGO, which is all about reconnecting, reunifying trafficked children with their families in Nepal. And Connor's written a best-selling book called Little Princes. I'm not sure if some of you have read the book. It's a great read, but it's basically explains the whole process of how this happened. How just a normal average guy went to Nepal, had this experience, and discovered this terrible process of orphanage trafficking, and did something about it. So if you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to read it. It's a really good book. So NGN works in Nepal with a local Nepali NGO, which actually carries out our work here. So we work together in partnership, and they're called the Himalayan Innovative Society, or THIS for short. So you might hear me mention the acronym THIS. We've currently got 4 projects in Nepal. Our main project is all about the reintegration of trafficked children. So it's about working with the government to do a rescue of children in an abusive orphanage, to rehabilitate them if they've been abused. So we physically, psychologically, emotionally rehabilitate them. We then find their families, we reconnect them with their families, we reunify them, and then we monitor them to make sure that they're not displaced again from their families. That's our core project. We also do work around trying to promote ethical voluntourism and discouraging orphanage voluntourism, which is what this presentation is about. We also work with the government and other civil society organisations to to spread our work basically, and train others in our approach, and give technical advice to other organisations that need it. And we also give scholarships, educational scholarships, and mentoring to ex-trafficked youth. To date, we've reunified about 124 displaced children with their families, and we've got a 100% success rate. Every child who was trafficked into an orphanage and we reunified is now still living with their families happily. No child has been displaced again or trafficked again. And we also reconnected about 480 children with their families, so they haven't gone back to their families, they're at least in contact with them. So let's talk about orphanages and children's homes in Nepal. Give you a few statistics to begin with. According to government statistics, there are around 800 registered children's homes or orphanages in Nepal. The two terms are often used interchangeably, children's home and orphanage. But they're just the official figures. If you were to include the unregistered orphanages and illegal orphanages, the figure's probably quite a bit higher. Officially, these orphanages contain about 15,000 children. But again, if we were to include the unofficial orphanages, unregistered ones, this figure again would be much higher. From the most recent research that was carried out, which goes back in fact to 2008, we know that at least 2 out of 3 children living in orphanages are not orphans. They've got at least one living parent. Many of them have got 2 living parents, but they're still often presented as being orphans. The chances are that today that percentage is even higher, because back in 2008, the civil war had just finished in Nepal. There was more reason why children living in orphanages might be orphans, but today there's a lot less reason. So we think that the vast majority of children living in orphanages are not orphans. They have at least one living parent. The other slightly shocking statistic is that around 90% of orphanages and children's homes are located in the 5 main tourist districts of the country. And I'll show you this on a map. So you can see here a map of Nepal with 75 districts within it. The 5 districts marked in red are the 5 main tourist districts where most of the tourists come to for trekking, for wildlife parks, and so on. So up to 90% of orphanages are located in these tourist districts. These districts don't necessarily correspond with level of population, with need of children. So we think it's no coincidence that the vast majority of orphanages have been set up in tourist areas. We think the reason for that is because that's the area where you can most easily attract funds from volunteers and foreign donors that might want to support your orphanage. So, Nepal. I'm not sure if anyone has been to Nepal, but it's a very beautiful country. We've got the Himalayas, we've got Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. You can go trekking in some of the last known wildernesses in the world. You can go to wildlife reserves. We've got beautiful Buddhist stupas, Hindu temples, Nawari architecture. It's a Shangri-La, a beautiful, beautiful country. So every year, thousands and thousands of tourists come to Nepal to see it and experience it. But the thing that they're often struck with when they get here is poverty. They've come for this trip of a lifetime. They've spent thousands of dollars to do the Everest trek, something like that. And then they see people on the street begging. They go to villages where they see people living a bit like people used to live in Europe in the Middle Ages. And it shocks them. Here they are spending thousands of dollars, and here are people living in terrible, terrible conditions. And they feel like they want to do something. They want to give something back to Nepal. They want to volunteer. They want to make a donation to help these people that have been so hospitable and help them have this wonderful experience. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to volunteer in an orphanage. It's one of the most easy, tangible ways of doing something to help Nepal. If you Google Nepal volunteer, you will get literally hundreds of entries like this in this slide about volunteering opportunities. And most of them are actually to volunteer in a children's home. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Just checking. So typically, if you arrange a volunteering placement from outside of Nepal, from the US or Europe, you could be paying anything from $200 up to $500 for a week or two's volunteering in an orphanage. It's quite a lot of money. If you're not that organized and you just turn up in Nepal, you're backpacking, if you go to the tourist areas, in tourist cafes and bars and restaurants, you'll see notices like this one here. asking for foreigners to come and volunteer in an orphanage. So this one talks about having 10 children who are totally orphans and poor, and it encourages foreign volunteers to come along and work for the orphanage. Typically, you might pay $100, $200 if you respond to one of these adverts, or you may pay nothing, but at the end you'll be encouraged to make a donation or give something to help out in some way. They'll want something from you for your experience of volunteering in their orphanage. So I'm going to give you a few case studies now of people who have actually volunteered in orphanages and what's happened, what the effects have been of that. So the first case study is about a couple of Australian girls who came to Nepal in 2006 as part of their round the world tour. And as part of their tour, they wanted to do something good. They wanted to help a lesser developed country. So they wanted to volunteer in an orphanage. So in this picture here, the blonde girl is a girl called Jessica from Australia. And she volunteered in an orphanage called Mukti Nepal alongside her friend Nicole, also from Australia. And we know quite a bit about their experience of volunteering because Nicole kept quite a detailed blog, which I've given the source there in this slide. In Nicole's blog, we learn about how they worked with the children, they supported them, they played with them, they took them on outings. And Nicole talked a lot about how inspired she was by the orphanage owner, a lady called Goma Luitel, who's a lady in the blue dress in the picture here. Goma was an inspiring social worker, doing all this work for these poor orphans who had no family. She dedicated her life to help these orphans, and Jessica and Nicole were only too happy to help her. And as well as playing with the children, they helped Goma with fundraising. They wrote letters to ex-volunteers, to donors, asking for funds towards the orphanage. They donated things themselves. They went out and bought gifts for the children and for Goma. And here's a quote from Nicole in her blog. She says, "I have decided to take some photos and send an email out to friends of Mukti, requesting donations for the project and see what sort of response we receive. It would be fantastic to achieve something so significant during my stay here." So Jessica and Nicole had a wonderful 3 months, wrote about it very positively. Then they went off and carried on with the rest of their world tour. And that was the end of that. So let's move forward 10 years in Mukti Nepal orphanage and find out what happened. So this is let's move forward to 4 years, sorry. This is a picture that was taken in the year 2010 of Goma with some of the children in the orphanage in their school uniforms. By this stage, Goma was reported to have become a very wealthy woman. She was reported to be wearing very nice jewelry, have a nice house, and so on. She was also reported to have found one key donor in Spain who was providing all the funds for the orphanage, giving her everything she needed. But in actual fact, she was still fundraising with the volunteers. She was still going out and she was still asking volunteers to write letters to other people to raise money for the orphanage, despite having enough funds already. Now, although Goma presented herself as this selfless, compassionate, caring social worker, the truth was very different. When the volunteers weren't there, Goma was beating the children, threatening the children, spitting on the children, swearing at the children. She was telling the children that if you ever tell the volunteers that you're not real orphans, that you have family members, then you'll be harmed. I'll hurt you. I'll throw you out. You'll have big problems. So you must perpetuate this lie that you're orphans, because this is what brings money into the orphanage. There are reported cases of some of the parents of the children trying to get into the orphanage to get access to their children, and they were denied access. There are stories of even some of the parents having to disguise themselves and as trying to get jobs as staff there just so they could get access to their children. Goma is reported to have threatened the parents and said, if you try and intervene and get your children back, I've got strong government connections. You have no chance of getting your children back. They're here with me now. In late 2010, Goma went too far. One of the children in the orphanage, a girl, was on her way back from school and she was hit by a vehicle. She became very, very sick and this angered Goma. So Goma put her on the roof of the orphanage. We have flat roofs of the houses here in Nepal. So she left her on the roof of the orphanage until she got better. Of course, she didn't get better. She was very sick. She'd been in a road accident. This angered Goma more. So she sent the children up with metal rods and nettles and insisted they beat this girl. Of course, this severely injured the girl. Fortunately, one of Goma's relatives was visiting, saw what had happened and took the girl to the hospital. Unfortunately, it was too late. The girl died of her injuries. But Goma managed to persuade the authorities that she was in no way responsible for the girl's death, and things carried on. However, this sowed the seeds of the beginning of the end for Goma. A volunteer from Germany came back to visit the children, and by now the children were severely traumatized of what was happening in Mukti. And slowly they began to open up to this volunteer and tell her what was happening. This German volunteer reported it to an NGO in Nepal, who reported it to the government, and the government, along with a number of NGOs, including NGN, carried out a rescue, and we rescued 20 children from Mukti, Nepal. They stayed with us in our transit home, we found their families, and we were able to reunify 18 of the 20 children. 18 of those children are now living happily and sustainably with their families. They never needed to live in that orphanage. The only reason they were there is because they could raise money for Goma. The 2 children we couldn't reunify were because Goma had destroyed all records of where they came from, and they were too young to remember the full details of where they came from. We tried for about 3 years. We did everything. We did TV adverts, radio adverts. We couldn't find their families. So they've ended up going to a good quality children's home. The point is that the only reason those children were there is because they could be used as poverty commodities, as a fundraising tool for Goma to raise money. If it hadn't been for volunteers like Jessica and Nicole, who in good faith came to volunteer and do something good for Nepal, but if it hadn't been for volunteers wanting to do that and being willing to pay money, the girl would probably still be alive, and all these children would never have suffered all that psychological trauma, and they would have been with their families all along. So I'm going to move on to the next case study. This is a picture of Lars Olsen. He's an Australian philanthropist, and back in 2006 he was backpacking in Nepal, and he volunteered in a number of orphanages. He was very inspired by what he saw, and he decided that he wanted to set up his own orphanage. And he had a group of 20 girls who were all orphans, so he believed, and he set up an orphanage for them, and he found a group of local Nepali women who would care for the children, who he trusted, and he set up the orphanage called Forget Me Not. He then went back to Australia. He raised loads of money for the orphanage. He was very, very successful at doing this, and he sent the money over. He set up an INGO in Australia. He set up a board. The board would come over regularly to visit the children, and they'd carry out financial audits. They'd monitor the organisation. They'd check the girls were okay. As far as they were concerned, they called it the charity to end all charities. It was a perfect children's home. These girls were being materially very, very well cared for. It wasn't like Mukti. They were going to good schools, they had good clothes, they had good food, they had kind staff that were looking after them. Everything seemed to be wonderful. It was a really good quality children's home. So all was going well until about 2012. Forget Me Not, the organisation, appointed their first in-country director, a member of staff working in the country. It was an American lady called Eva Capazola, and she spoke fluent Nepali. And because she was here, she started bonding with the girls. And bit by bit, the girls started opening up to her and telling her their true story of what had happened. It turned out things were not so rosy in Forget Me Not, as the Australian board had been led to believe. The girls had all been trafficked. They'd been taken from their families. Most of them had families. There were stories of family members coming to the gates of the orphanage and the girls waving at them, and then the family members physically being turned away. The girls had all been threatened that you're never to talk about your families to the Australian board. If you talk to the Australian board about your families and tell them the truth, you'll be harmed, you'll be beaten, you'll be thrown out. You'll lose the facilities you've got here. So they were living under threat, basically. They were there so they could raise money. So the local board of Nepali women who were running the home were taking money, were profiting from it. And they needed the girls to perpetuate this lie about why they were there. It was hard work for Eva to effect a rescue and get the girls out, but by working with the government and working with NGOs like NGN, it took her about 7 months of painstaking legal work in which she came under all sorts of threats and risked her own life to try and get the girls out, but she was able to do so. The girls were rescued, and working in partnership with NGN, Forget Me Not have now managed to reunify 15 of the girls with their families. So 15 of the girls have families that were willing to take them back. They're living very happily now in their villages. Of the other 5, 4 of them have been reconnected, and Forget Me Not are still going to try and reunify them. Only one girl they couldn't find the family of. So again, another case where girls or children have been trafficked and were being used as poverty commodities to raise money for unscrupulous people by tricking well-meaning, people from Western countries to try and make money from them. The Australians had done everything. They'd seen the death certificates of the girls' families, they'd done financial audits, they'd monitored regularly, they'd done everything they could to check this was a bona fide orphanage, and the wool was still pulled over their eyes. Last case study, a very short one this time. This is Daman. He is a 13-year-old boy, or he's probably 14 now. He's 13 when we rescued him. We rescued him last November from an orphanage on the outskirts of Kathmandu. When he was rescued, he weighed just 18 kilograms, which is only about, I think, 3 or 4 kilos more than my 4-year-old son, and yet he's 13. Daman was living in an orphanage where many of the children were not being fed. They were being starved. There were about, we rescued 18 children, but there were reports of there sometimes being 30 children, all sleeping in one small room. It was unclean. There was no water in the orphanage. None of them could wash. The toilet was covered in excrement. There was the little bit of food that was in the house was crawling with insects. Often they ate no more than popcorn. Daman was chronically and severely malnourished. It took months to get him back to health again. As well as being physically harmed by what happened to him, he was psychologically harmed. As a 13-year-old, he couldn't tie his shoelaces, and he suffered significant post-traumatic stress. Daman, the orphanage owner, was actually receiving lots of donations from local people. There was an NGO based in London in the UK that was supporting the orphanage, and they'd even managed to attract their first volunteer, a British volunteer. Unfortunately for the orphanage owner, this British volunteer was a community nurse, figured out what was going on. There was something wasn't right. She reported to the government, and that's what brought it to our attention and allowed us to do the rescue to get the kids out. We've now found Daman's family. We're hopeful we will be able to reunify him with his family. It won't be easy, but we should be able to. Daman has been permanently scarred from this experience. He'll never really fully recover, psychologically, mentally, physically. But he's a lucky one. He got out. There are many, many more Damans out there in orphanages in Nepal today who are being used basically as profit-making tools to raise money from foreign volunteers, sometimes Nepalese as well, from donors, from NGOs, charities, and so on. So I hope that gives you some picture of how orphanage trafficking works and orphanage voluntourism works, and how children are being used as poverty commodities to raise money from unsuspecting but well-meaning and well-intentioned foreign volunteers, tourists, donors, and so on. I'm going to talk now a little bit about orphanage voluntourism, the pros and cons. I'm going to tell you what the arguments are for orphanage voluntourism as well, because it's important you hear the other side of the story and not just the arguments against it. So first of all, the arguments for orphanage voluntourism. The biggest argument that's used is that the orphanages need money. They say we need volunteers, paying volunteers to sustain our running costs, to pay for food, to pay for shelter, to pay for rent, to pay for medical costs, educational costs. If we don't have volunteers coming and paying us, we can't afford to run the orphanage. Of course, our argument is that the very fact that the volunteers are willing to pay the money, that's what is the incentive to create the orphanage in the first place. It's the other way around. But this is the argument people will use for taking paying volunteers. It's also fair to say that in a country like Nepal, orphanage voluntourism is bringing in probably hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to the Nepal economy. And for a very poor country like Nepal, which is very reliant on money from tourism, this is important. It's not to be sniffed at, and we have to take that seriously. That tourism, volunteering is really important to the Nepali economy. And if we just take that away, it's going to have all sorts of other side effects. The second argument for orphanage voluntourism is that it creates a space for the sharing of cultures and ideas. It creates a cultural dialogue between foreigners from Western countries and Nepali children and Nepali staff. There's an advert here on this slide from which was on a website for advertising places for volunteers to come to their orphanage, which talks about being a time to remember. You'll share your culture, you'll learn from each other. The orphan children seek your love and care. And I think there is something to be said about this cultural dialogue that takes place when foreigners meet with Nepalese and they can talk about their own experience. And I'll come back to this idea later when I talk about the concept of ethical voluntourism. So now the arguments against orphanage voluntourism. Well, the most compelling argument against it is that the very fact there are paying volunteers willing to give money towards orphanages and donors willing to give money toward orphanages, this is actually fueling children being displaced from their families and from their communities to be put in orphanages. Orphanages are actually being set up to meet the demand of the volunteering industry, of people who want to volunteer. Just to explain how this process happens, the traffickers go out to very, very poor villages where people have never been to Kathmandu. There's a lot of poverty. People are hopeful, they want a way out, and they've been told that education is one of the best ways you can get out of this poverty trap. And the traffickers say to them, look, you pay me $200, $300, $400. I'll take your child to Kathmandu, I'll enroll them in a really good boarding school. 15 years from now, they'll come back to your village, they'll be really well educated, they'll have a great job, they'll have lots of money, they'll support you in your old age. Now, these are uneducated people. Rationally, this makes sense. The traffickers are often someone they know, they're someone from their community, they may even be a relative. It works for a series of brokers as a chain, so often the trafficker may not even know the full story of what's going to happen. They've been paid to do this for somebody else. So the families believe this. Logically, in terms of what they understand about what's going to happen to their child, they're making a decision in the best interest of their child. So they go into debt, they borrow money, they pay $300, $400, and the child disappears with the trafficker to a good boarding school. Of course, in practice, it isn't a good boarding school. It's a profit-making orphanage where we know that, well, in some cases, the children are well cared for, but they're threatened, that they can't tell the truth. In other cases, they're abused, they're starved, they're beaten, and so on. So the traffickers can make money at both ends of the scale. They can make money from the families and from the tourists and the volunteers. Children are being used as poverty commodities. So my point is that orphanage voluntourism is fueling this trade in trafficking and profit making. The second argument against orphanage voluntourism is that when you put children in institutions, in orphanages and children's homes, it harms them mentally, physically, psychologically. The United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child, the United Nations Guidelines for the Alternative Care of Children, Nepal's policies and laws are all united in saying that children's homes should be used as a last resort. It's not good for children. The first resort should be you should stay with your parents. If that's not possible, you stay with another relative, uncles, aunts, cousins. If that's not possible, maybe you stay in foster care temporarily until you can find a family-based setting. Then consider adoption. Finally, the very last resort is a children's home because it's not good for children. So the laws and the policies are all clear on this, but unfortunately in Nepal, children's homes are becoming a first priority. Even when families can care for their children, they're being tricked and duped into sending their children to these children's homes. There's lots of evidence that being in an institution affects children psychologically, physically, mentally. There's evidence now that it even affects your brain size. Scientists are starting to find. It means that when you're growing up in a children's home, you don't form a healthy attachment with a primary caregiver, with a mother or father. You've got a rota of staff coming and going, and that affects you when you're an adult. It's very hard to form healthy attachments with friends, with family, with partners as an adult. You're more susceptible to depression. There's lots of evidence that people who grow up in children's homes don't do as well in terms of employment. They're more likely to get involved in crime and so on. There's loads of evidence out there. I'm not going to talk about it too much today, but it's not easy. It's very easy to find if you want to find it. Another thing in Nepal is that if you grow up in a children's home, you're cut off from your community and your family. And in a country like Nepal, where there's very little social welfare, your family and your community is your social welfare system. It's your parents that arrange your marriage, that find someone for you to marry. It's your mother or father that might try and help you find a job. You need to know your local language, your local dialect, so you can work in your community. If you've been separated from your rural community, you grow up in an orphanage in Kathmandu, when you go back, you don't know how to till the land, you don't know how to look after the animals, you can't go back to your farm and live a rural life again. Effectively, you've been cut off. You can never go back to your family. So the promise the traffickers talk about of coming back with wealth and riches just doesn't happen. It's just not possible. So you're let loose in a country where the only way to get ahead is to know people. It's not a transparent system. You can't just apply for a job and hope you can get it. You have to know people here. So people who grow up in orphanages are much more likely to get involved in crime, much more likely to be depressed. They face a lot more problems. And when volunteers are in orphanages, again, it perpetuates this problem. There's this roster of volunteers staying for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. They hug the children lots, give them lots of love, then they go. And for the volunteer, that's fine. They say, "Oh, I had a wonderful experience. It was great." For the child, it's like grief every single time. They start to form an attachment with this lovely woman from the UK. She's really nice to them. 3 weeks later, she goes. And it's devastating. Then it happens again. Then it happens again. And they quickly learn they have to emotionally harden themselves. They can't form attachments with people. So it's very, very psychologically harmful for children to grow up in children's homes. And when you're bringing in children to go to live in children's homes just so you can feed the needs of volunteers, that's not right. It's not helping the problem. The third argument against orphanage voluntourism is that it potentially creates a situation where children can be actively abused. In the worst case scenarios, there are cases in Nepal where paedophiles and child abusers have taken advantage of the lack of regulation and the easy access to children to come in and intentionally abuse children. So there's 3 examples here on this slide of a French guy, an Australian, and a British guy who were all convicted of sexually abusing children in children's homes because it was so easy to do so. You can go to a children's home, you can pay some money, you can pay a bit extra and take a child back to your room to have a day out. It's very easy to do if you want to. There are cases of Nepali people being convicted of sexually abusing children. Nepal is a country where there's legal impunity. The legal system doesn't really work. So the chances are that these few cases where people have actually been convicted are just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably many, many cases happening all the time of people coming to Nepal to sexually abuse children. I have colleagues that who believe that there's actually a shift from Southeast Asia now, where there's more regulation in places like Cambodia, Thailand, and so on, of sex tourists now coming to Nepal because there is such little regulation here. So there's huge, huge concern about this. Even on a much softer level, you have foreign volunteers that don't come here to abuse children, but they have no skills. They're not trained social workers, they're not trained psychologists. They have no skills in dealing and working with vulnerable children. In America, you would never be allowed to volunteer with vulnerable children if you weren't a social worker, you didn't have skills. The same in Europe, the same in Australia. But in Nepal, that's fine. In a lot of developing countries, there seem to be different rules. It's fine if you've got no skills to just hang out with trafficked kids and work with them. The fourth argument against orphanage voluntourism is that it's denying local Nepali people to take those jobs. People that understand the local culture, can speak the local language, and can bring these Nepali children up with Nepali values and Nepali culture are being denied these jobs because foreigners are doing it instead. That's damaging the economy, it's taking away people's jobs, it's affecting the children. The children are growing up often with more of an understanding of Western values than of local values, which is fine if they were going to go and live in the West, but they won't. They'll be set free when they reach 18 in Nepal and they won't understand their own culture. Nepali staff are much better placed to care for children in Nepal than foreigners are. They have the skills, they have the understanding, they have the language and so on. So it's not really helping Nepali children or the Nepali economy on this level as well. Okay, so what are we doing about this? Well, NGN we're a very small NGO, but we've been starting to kind of lead the fight back now and try to do advocacy to try and address this problem. One of the ways we've done this is that we've been working with the embassies in Nepal, the diplomatic missions here, and trying to spread awareness with them about this problem in the hope that they will change their travel advice for citizens from their countries coming to Nepal who might want to volunteer here. So far we've been successful with the United States, Switzerland, France and Britain. They've all changed their travel advice. I'll let you read the advice here, or perhaps for the sake of the recording I'll read it out. This is the US Embassy advice to US citizens visiting Nepal. A number of Nepal-based volunteer organizations maintain websites offering volunteer opportunities. The embassy has received reports that many, if not a majority of such opportunities, especially those involving volunteering at orphanages or children's homes, are not charities, but rather profit-making enterprises set up with the primary purpose of attracting donations from abroad and financial support from volunteers. Many of the children are not, in fact, orphans, and thus volunteering at such an organisation indirectly contributes to child exploitation. An organisation's bona fides can be confirmed by contacting the Nepal Central Child Welfare Board. report, CCWB, and then it gives the details. So it was great when the US Embassy changed this because it inspired the French Embassy and the British Embassy to do the same, and we're still working with the other orphanages to do this. NGN has also produced an FAQ sheet, which I think has been added to the blog, which I believe you've read, where we talk about this issue, we explain it, and we give some advice on how you can volunteer ethically, and I'll come on to that in a minute. We've now finished a full research report on this subject, which is called The Paradox of Orphanage Volunteering, Combating Child Trafficking Through Ethical Voluntourism. And I'll give you a sneak preview of that. It's going to come out in November, December, and I'll certainly share it with Eric, so you'll get some sight of it. I think you'll find it interesting. So what this report is about, what we talk about is, first of all, we talk about the history of orphanage trafficking in Nepal, pretty much what I've talked to you about today. We give lots of evidence that links trafficking, institutionalization, and voluntourism in Nepal, showing how the three are linked and how voluntourism is fueling these problems. We then do some analysis of the concept of voluntourism. Why do people from wealthy countries want to come and volunteer in Nepal? Is it for altruistic reasons or is it for selfish reasons? Is it because they really want to help people in these countries, or is it because it's for their own egos and they want to put pictures on Facebook and they want to talk about it and they want to put it on their CVs to get jobs? Our conclusion is it's actually a bit of both. People come for selfish reasons but also altruistic reasons, and we accept that. That's a reality. We all do things for our own reasons as well as for other reasons as well. We can't pretend that we're all Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa. So we argue that we should work within this and look at ways in which we can make it ethical on those terms. We then look at some examples of ethical voluntourism around the world. What is ethical voluntourism? So we look at cases where the media have tried to spread awareness of this, campaign groups like the Child Safe Network. We look at some ethical volunteering companies. Like one example is a US-based volunteering company called Where There Be Dragons that runs something called learning service schemes, where you come to a country like Nepal, you learn from Nepalese before you try and help. So you learn how to plant rice, you learn how to work in a village and support the local economy. And if you can help, great, but it's as much about learning as giving back. It's a two-way process. It's not just about the white man coming to the developed country and solving their problems. It's about a dialogue, about a two-way process. In the final chapter, we talk about how to actually practice ethical voluntourism. One of the first pieces of advice we give is that if you're going to volunteer internationally, you should adopt what we call a learning mindset. That's not actually my term. It's a term that comes from Daniela Papi and Claire Bennett. And I believe you've been reading some of Daniela Papi's work. Daniela Papi and her friend Claire Bennett talk a lot about this. It's this idea that we need to learn before we can give. We can't just come out there to developing countries with no skills and try and solve everybody's problems just because we're from a developed country. We have to recognize that we need to learn about the local culture. We need to understand what the problems are before we can start trying to solve them. And it may be that all we can do is learn. Maybe we come to a country and we have a very interesting time. We learn a lot about local culture and local customs, and we find there isn't a lot we can give back. But it may make us more sensitive people, more culturally aware people. It may mean that later in life we can give something back. I just give an example of my own experience. When I was younger, I was 18. I went to India. I volunteered in a Tibetan refugee school. I taught English. I look back now and I think I wasn't a qualified teacher. What could I give these young students that local teachers couldn't give? I hope I did something good, but ultimately probably it benefited me maybe than it did more the local people I was trying to teach. It made me more culturally aware. It got me very interested in South Asia. I came back, did more volunteering experiences like that. I ended up going on to learn about international development, and now hopefully I've come with skills to actually work in Nepal and try and work with local people to change things. So maybe those first volunteering experiences were more about learning for me than actually about giving, but it's affected me later in life to give back. And that's what the learning mindset is about. It's about recognizing that it's fine to come out with the objective of learning rather than trying to help. In some ways, that's less selfish than coming out with a view of saying, I can solve all your problems just because I'm from Britain or just because I'm from America. The second thing is we talk about researching volunteering opportunities. You need to ask questions. People often say to me, well, just tell me which is a good company to go with. And I say, well, look, it's not that simple. You really need to think about this. You need to think about what you're doing. You need to think about, is what you're doing going to be sustainable? So if you go out there and you're going to dig a well in a village, group of foreigners come to some poor village, they dig a well, they say, well done, we dug your well, take some photographs, go home. 2 months later, the well breaks. No one in the village knows how to fix it. No one really cares. It wasn't their well. The foreigners did it. If you actually work with local people, you train them on how to build the well, you let them take the lead in building the well, and you're just there to support them, the chances are that when the well breaks, they'll know how to fix it. They will be more inclined to fix it because it's their well. They put ownership of it. So it's thinking about issues of sustainability. It's thinking about what skills you've got. What can you actually do to help local people? If you're a web designer, are you best placed to be working in an orphanage? Maybe you're best placed to work with the local NGO in Nepal and help them set up their website. I know lots of NGOs here that would love for a web designer from America or the UK to come over to Nepal and help them set up their website. They would appreciate that much more than someone that wants to hang out in an orphanage and train and play with kids. So it's thinking about the skills that you've got. Now, that might be teaching English, so you could use your English teaching skills. The other thing to think about is training up local change makers. Rather than just coming out, doing a little bit of help and leaving, if you can train a local person and give them your skills, and they can keep training people. This idea of do you fit? What's the expression? Do you train a man? Do you give someone a fish, or do you train a man how to fish so he can keep fishing? It's that whole philosophy. Ultimately, NGN does not really endorse orphanage voluntourism in the most part. We think it's harmful. We think it perpetuates trafficking. It perpetuates problems of children being kept away from their families rather than growing up in families. It causes attachment disorder and all the problems I've talked about. The only exceptions we make where we say we think it is okay to volunteer in an orphanage is if you have the right skills to do so. So you're a trained social worker, you're a trained psychologist, and then you can come for long enough to actually have a meaningful effect in the orphanage. We actually have at NGN, we're very fortunate. There's a very well-respected American psychologist who's an expert in trauma. And she came out earlier this year. She's coming out again in November to give training to our staff in how to help children who've been traumatized. She's an ethical tourist, as far as I'm concerned, an ethical volunteer. She's got a tremendous amount of skills in how to deal with trauma. She's going to be working with the staff as much as she is with the children. And she's here to transfer her knowledge to the staff so the Nepalis have those skills, and then they can work with the children. That's a rare case of ethical volunteering when it concerns, in our case, a transit home, a place where we can keep the kids until they go back to their families. As well as NGN, there's lots of other organisations doing some great work out there. The media have taken a really active stance in this. I think you've read some of the media articles that are out there. People like Daniela Papi, Rafia Zakaria wrote a great article recently in Al Jazeera America about this issue. There was a great article about Nepal in the UK's The Guardian newspaper, which talked about this problem. We're starting to see some tour companies changing their practices. I've got friends here who run tourist companies, and they used to offer orphanage voluntourism as a package. Had no idea that it was a problem. They've taken that off their brochures now. They no longer offer it. So things are starting to change very slowly. We're starting to see other international NGOs revising their missions and their volunteer policies. Forget Me Not's a great example. This was an organisation that was all about running a children's home. Now it's completely changed its mission. Now they do reintegration of children. They're all about spreading awareness of ethical voluntourism. The whole organisation has changed, and that's a fantastic thing to see when an organisation has got the courage to change what they're all about and what their message is about. The Umbrella Foundation, which is another well-respected international NGO here from Ireland, they run children's homes. They also run reintegration schemes. They try and get children back wherever they can to their families. But they also used to run orphanage volunteering. People used to come and play with the kids, hang out with the kids. They're in the process of changing that now. They're trying to set up placements where the volunteers can work with staff, maybe provide classroom support, teaching opportunities. They're trying to move towards ethical voluntourism, which is fantastic to see. And it's a testament that it is possible to change your volunteering practices. The government of Nepal is starting to take this problem seriously. They're talking about it. One of the problems we have is that the government still don't really recognise this as, officially the problem is it's illegal. It's illegal to volunteer in Nepal. This is something that's not enforced in practice. You can just walk into a tourist area, there's adverts everywhere for volunteering. The government don't enforce this law. But when we try and raise it with the government, there's still a problem. They don't really want to talk about it. They just say it's illegal, therefore we don't go there. It's it's like saying to people, don't do drugs. Drugs are illegal, don't do it, so let's not talk about it. Reality is people are still going to do drugs, so you still need to have campaigns and information about if you're going to do drugs, do it safely. It's the same with volunteering. It might be illegal here, but thousands of people are doing it. So our view is we still need to have information about doing it ethically, so you don't harm yourself, you don't harm other people. Finally, it's been great to see more international campaigns about this. Something that Eric and myself have both been involved with is something called the Better Volunteering, Better Care Project. Eric and I were both in London back in, I think it was June, and met people from all over the world working on these issues, from the media, from universities, from NGOs, from the tourism sector, sharing ideas, looking for ways in which we can spread more awareness and come up with ethical alternatives to volunteering in orphanages. But more needs to be done. We're certainly things are just starting here in Nepal. We're not as far on as countries like Cambodia, where there's a lot more infrastructure, a lot more's happening. We do need more awareness about this, better coordination between the agencies, and we do need a clear government position and strategy, which we're getting there, but it's still to happen. I'm going to finish with this picture, which you've probably seen before. This is the wonderful campaign of an NGO called Friends International in Cambodia. It's called the Child Safe Campaign, and it's on websites, it's on the back of tuk-tuks in Cambodia. Children are not tourist attractions, and I just love this image of children inside a museum, a glass case with foreigners taking pictures of them. I think that image alone says it all, that why it's not appropriate, it's not ethical to be volunteering in orphanages. We wouldn't do it in our own countries as a tourist experience, so why do we do it in developing countries? The standards shouldn't be different. So I just said for your information at the end of the slideshow here, I've given email address and website and so on, but I'll go back to the child safe image and say, I'll open up to questions. I think we've got about 15-20 minutes. If you've got any questions, comments, anything you want to talk about, I'm all ears.
How did you get started doing this type of work?
You mean me personally?
Yes.
Or NGN? I mean, personally, I started off as a voluntourist, you could say. When I was 18, before I went to university, I came to India on a scheme called GAP. And I worked in a school, a Tibetan refugee school. Fell in love with India, decided I really wanted to work in a developing country. Came back, did bits of research for my degree. At one stage I worked in an orphanage. I was a volunteer in an orphanage in Peru. Had no idea why it was a problem. Had no skills really to work in that orphanage. And one thing led to another, and I started working for charities and then got involved in international development. I took a job. My first job was in India, working against child trafficking in India and child labour, which led on to a contract in Nepal and finally working with NGN. So one thing led to another, but I think it's fair to say that the roots of my work now do go back to being a voluntourist, where I probably didn't have the skills to do so. But I like to think that I learned from that experience, and it made me a more sensitive individual, so I could come out and be more culturally aware and hopefully do something good in Nepal.
Okay, I have a question for you. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. How long the process is it to get the children out of the orphanage once you identify that they're in danger?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really varies. It's kind of like how long is a piece of string. The last rescue we did, the government actually told us about it and said, "Can you rescue these kids?" We had funding in place, and the whole thing happened in a matter of days, just like that. It was great. We could get the kids out. The rescue we did before that, which was I think June 2013, it took almost a year of lobbying. We had to lobby central government, local government. It was politically very complicated. There were many people involved that didn't want it to happen. The background to it had been that some girls had been sexually abused in the orphanage, but the management of the orphanage had actually changed. Even so, many of the child protection actors were saying these children need to go home. They may well have been trafficked. They ought to be given the choice whether they want to go home or not after what's happened. But there were many people arguing against that and saying that the orphanage should keep running. I would say probably because they realised the potential to make money out of it. The orphanage had it'd been in the news a lot because these girls had been sexually abused, and I think they were trying to profit from that. Lots of people were giving them money because they wanted to help. So it took a year. There have been other cases where it's gone on for 6 months, 8 months, and then the whole case has been stopped. There have been cases where key people who have power have been issued death threats by traffickers and organised criminal groups, and they just said, that's it, I can't do it. It's not going to go any further. So there have been cases where we've just had to walk away. We know that children are being abused and there's nothing we can do. We're not the government here. We're a foreign NGO in Nepal. There's nothing we can do. So it really does depend. In my experience, every single rescue's been different. It's just everywhere. Yeah, no one's ever the same.
So what do you guys consider some ethical options for people that are wanting to volunteer?
We've got on our FAQs, which is on the blog, we've listed a number of websites to look at. One that I really like is called learningservice.info, and it's been set up by Daniela Papi, Claire Bennett, and some other people. And it's really not just about thinking about volunteering, but thinking about learning. Rather than saying, I've just got to go out there and help, it's about what I was talking about earlier. Trying to go and learn as much as give. See if there's some scheme where it can be a two-way process. So that's a bit abstract, I know, but I think it's important to say that. Other things that are ethical are, again, it's not just as simple as saying this organisation is fine, this one's not fine. Working with injured animals is fine, but working with children isn't fine. It just depends on the situation. I think it's matching your own skills to a placement, thinking whatever that placement is, if it's working with injured animals, do you have the skills to work with those injured animals? Are you the right person to do that? If it's doing an environmental cleanup, do you have the skills to do that? It might not be that skilled. It might just be involved picking up litter from a beach. Maybe that's quite easy to do. Thinking about the potential harm it could cause to people. Are you going to be putting a local person out of a job? Is it sustainable? Are you working with local people, training them so they can carry on the work after you've gone? I wish it was black and white and I could just say, this is ethical volunteering, this is unethical volunteering. Unfortunately, it's not. It's about really thinking through these issues, thinking through the impact of what your actions are going to have, and thinking about what the attitude that you're coming to a volunteering placement with and the skills that you're coming with. Sorry I can't be clearer, but unfortunately people have to think and do their research and really think about these things before they sign up.
I have a question. What would you suggest is the best way for us to spread awareness or help this cause as college students are far away from Nepal?
I think it's great that you want to do that. I think it's from what I gather from Eric, you're studying this and you're going to write about it. I would say talk to your friends about it. Maybe between terms you're going to go backpacking, or maybe after university you'll go backpacking. Tell your friends about it. Someone says, "Hey, I'm going off to India and Nepal. I'm going to go backpacking." Tell them about this. Tell them about the problems. Talk to your families about it. Write articles about it in the student newspaper. Get the information out there. And there's lots of sources. There's this presentation. There's lots of articles written. Talk to people about it. This is how it will spread. The moment people are shocked when they hear about this, they have no idea this is happening. So I would say talk to your friends, write about it. That's the best you can do. Word of mouth is the most powerful advocacy tool. That's what's really going to influence people. Even if people get an idea in their head that there's a problem, isn't there, with volunteering in an orphanage, they might then make the effort to Google it, and then they'll find out about it. And my hope is that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this won't be this weird concept of how can it possibly be wrong to volunteer in an orphanage. By then, people will know there's a problem with it. It's not as ethical as people used to think it was.
Thank you, Martin, for all of this. I have a couple of questions, and we have Severin Chevrel speaking with class on Thursday. So this first question, she may be in a better position to answer than you. Feel free to punt it if you like. But you've given us a really great deep profile of Nepal. Do you have a sense of the, well, one question is, I think you said there are about 800 to 900 registered children's homes in Nepal. I was wondering about how many children are in this situation in Nepal. And the question that I'm not sure you'll know the answer to is, any sense of the number of children around the world in orphanages and how that's being affected?
Well, in Nepal, the official figures put it at about just over 15,000 children living in orphanages. We think it's probably higher than that. It could be, just as a pure guess on my part, I would say 17, 18, 19,000, maybe a bit less. Of those that are being, I think there's a spectrum then. There are some very good children's homes, don't get me wrong. There are some really well-run homes where there's clear checks to see if the children have families, the children are well looked after, abuses don't happen. And then you kind of go down the spectrum to all the really abusive ones. So it's hard to put a number on exactly how many children have been trafficked, exactly how many children are being abused. It just depends. Even like the Forget-Me-Not case is really interesting because materially, the children were well cared for. They were going to a great school. They had good food. They had a colour TV, but they were still being denied their basic human rights to have access to their families. So in some ways, that was more worrying that the underlying problem was hidden. In terms of internationally, I think I remember that it's about 80% of children living in children's homes and orphanages are considered to be not to be orphans. I think it's around 80%. So it's similar to Nepal. Severin will be able to confirm that though. In terms of the number of children living in children's homes and orphanages internationally, I'm not sure, but I'm sure Severin will know that.
Great, thank you. And the other thing I've been thinking about as you've been presenting, this is a course on leadership, and one of the interesting, severe challenges I think in this area is you have a global issue, or people are, have these good intentions in the global north or in the west. There's not really one clear governance authority that would say have responsibility for the relationships that are global in nature and relate to children in Nepal or children in Cambodia or wherever. And so the question is, if you can just think for a second, take a step back, how have you been impressed by others exercising leadership to address this issue? I'm hearing how you're part of a global network that's been do so.
It sounds like an essay question now, Eric, but it's a good question. So it was how am I impressed by the people taking leadership on this? Well, I think talking from personal experience, when we first started this work in Nepal, we felt a little bit like we were the only people doing this. We're a bit cut off here in Nepal. Internet connections are not good. We're a little bit in our own worlds. And it felt like there was myself and a number of volunteers, in fact, ethical volunteers working on this. We thought, does no one else see the problem? Who else is doing stuff on this? And then we gradually managed to find other like-minded people in Nepal working on it. And I have to say, it wasn't really till earlier this year when I got involved in the Better Volunteering, Better Care project, when I met people like yourself and people like Severin, a lot of the activists in Cambodia, they've been doing this work for years, people in the US and Britain and other countries in the media, in universities and so on, showing leadership on this and trying to do something within their own sectors. And I was amazed, and I was really heartened that people really cared about this. That it's not just people working in developing countries; it's people back in the source countries where the volunteers come from. And I find this subject fascinating because, it's like you said at the beginning, a few seconds ago, this is not a developing world problem or a developed world problem. This is a problem in both cases, and it's not that people in the developed world are wholly responsible for this. They're partly responsible, and people in the developing world are partly responsible. And it's a symptom of globalization, and it's a symptom of inequality. When we live in a world where there's huge inequality between developed and developing worlds, this is a symptom. People will want to do some good. I want to feel that they're doing some good. This will happen. So in answer to your question, I think this is a really it's an interesting area because there isn't a clear answer at the moment. There's not a really obvious way forward to say this is the answer, this is the golden bullet, this is what we've got to do. And I think that it takes real leadership when people are prepared to speak out and do something in an area where it's so unclear, where you really have to think about what the right way forward is or isn't. So if it's in a university, it's people like yourself raising awareness with students. If it's in the media, it's spreading awareness through articles. If it's in civil society, it's doing things like running reintegration programs or campaigns. And I really admire everyone who's involved in this because they're stepping into unknown terrain. We don't really know where this is going to go. This is a symptom of the globalized world we live in, and it's a fascinating and I think admirable area to show leadership in and have a go at trying to do something about it.
Thanks for taking on that essay question. And the other thing I wondered about, and I didn't warn you I was going to ask this question, I guess it wouldn't be fair to do so, but Garrett's question about how you got involved also made me think of some of the class content is on the values that are beneath people's decisions, for career, for personal leadership, et cetera. So you mentioned how you got involved sort of instrumentally, there's a path, but do you ever step back and think, why do I do this? Here I am in Nepal, quite far from home. What's motivating you for all this work?
Gosh, I could probably talk about this for hours and still not really give you a satisfactory answer. I think it was, there's all sorts of, I could give you all sorts of rational reasons about being interested in international development and so on. But I think more than anything, it was a kind of gut instinct for me. I grew up in quite a middle class, well-to-do white area of the UK. I never even flew on an aeroplane until I was 17. Went on, furthest I went was France, kind of thing. Suddenly went to India at the age of 18, and was kind of blown away by it. Was blown away by the poverty. Kind of hated it, loved it all at the same time. And it kind of changed my life course, really. There was something about it that kind of there was something in my inner being that just kind of resonated with it, that it drove me mad, but I kept wanting to go back and kept wanting to have something to do with it. In my own case as well, actually, when I was in my 20s, I had an illness that was sort of affected my mobility and my ankles, and I was ill for a couple of years. And during that time, I think I thought a lot more about suffering in the world and people who are struggling, and it sort of hardened my sense of feeling like I wanted to go out there and do something to help. But hopefully combine that with knowledge and skills, and it sort of drew me back to South Asia. So it was not altogether a rational reason why I'm here. It was something very sort of within me that drove me here to do this work. There were times I question it and think, why am I here? Why am I struggling with power cuts and pollution and cars that drive crazily along the roads and corruption and death threats, not to me but to people I know? Why didn't I just go back to England and settle down and have a nice house and look after the garden and just like take life easy? But for some reason, something still drags me out here. I think ultimately it's more rewarding to do this kind of work. For me anyway. I know I get bored. If I was living in a nice middle-class town in England, watching TV on a Friday night and going out to the pub on a Saturday night, I think I just get bored too quickly. So I need a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking a good solid go at that one. We are having students coming in anticipation of the next class, so we're going to have to tie things up here. Thank you so much for taking some time with us, and thanks to these students for coming in so early on a what do we have, Tuesday here. And we will certainly stay in contact as we do more learning on this, but thank you very much, Martin. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for asking me. And again, thanks to all the students that came in at 8 o'clock in the morning. I appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Eric. Take care. All the best. Bye.